This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
A new peer-reviewed study conducted by the team of independent researchers led by scholars from the University of Cape Town, they found evidence of repeated denial, interference and misrepresentation of the science by the city of Cape Town in response to a long-standing contamination in the city's rivers, wetlands and coastal waters. The research highlights how municipal officials have ignored or undermined independent scientific findings about serious public health risks, despite extensive evidence of raw and poorly treated sewage entering urban water bodies and coastal zones. Here now to unpack the study in more detail, we are joined by Professor Lesley Green, the Director of Environmental Humanities South. We're also joined by Nikiwe Solomon, a senior lecturer at UCT. I see on my schedule that Professor Leslie Petrik is also supposed to be on the program, or is scheduled to be on the program, and we'll wait to see whether Prof. Leslie Petrik, who's the leader of Environmental and Nanoscience Research Group at UWC, will join him in just a bit. But let's now welcome Professor Lesley Green as well as Nikiwe Solomon. Good morning to the both of you. Thank you very much for having joined us. Maybe just to start off with, before we get to the study, what was the intention, behind the study? We have, of course, sources of water bodies that exist in the forms of rivers, and canals and dams that some flow into the ocean, particularly the rivers that flow into the ocean, and the contention that those water bodies, particularly the rivers, are being polluted, and that pollution making its way into the ocean. Is that the simple understanding of what was behind it and the extent to which those water bodies may be polluted? Prof. Green?
Salam alaikum, and thank you so much for having us on the show. What we found was that our data on rivers, on lakes and the oceans was repeatedly showing harmful findings. But when we presented the data to city officials over many years, there was repeated pushback, often on grounds that we knew were not necessarily scientific. They might have sounded like science, but they didn't actually stand up if you gave them detailed scrutiny. Nikiwe, would you like to speak to the rivers issue?
Sure. Thank you for letting us join you on the program. So my research was focused on an urban river here in Cape Town, and we found high levels of E. coli and enterococci, which are quite harmful to human health and animal health, and, just causes havoc within ecologies. So we presented this data to the city of Cape Town, hoping that we would be able to work together to resolve the issues. However, there was quite a bit of pushback in terms of how they engaged with us, because we were involving community members that were affected by these polluted rivers. So this was seen as a political ploy, whereas we were just trying to find a way forward, and we were criticized for bringing, causing an alarm during the holiday season, which would affect tourism and so on. So there was multiple layers to our findings that would impact just the general use of Cape Town's waterways.
I remember this because the executive mayor at the time, in the response to these claims, had said that the water bodies are regularly then tested against an international benchmark, the figures of which are released. And yes, while E. coli and others are sometimes traced, or traces thereof are found, they're nowhere above the international benchmark level, and suggesting that they in no way harmful to the point where there should be public alarm and outcry. So I suppose, Nikiwe, to stay with you quickly on that sort of response at the time that I received from the executive mayor, is that underplaying the extent to which we see the levels of E. coli, that you believe those levels are demonstrative of a public healthcare risk?
So it comes back to what we were highlighting in our article, the way in which the testing is done. So for the research that I did, when I conducted the tests, the limits, or this particular river, the Kills River, had E. coli levels of over 1 million per 100 cubic milliliters. for 100 milliliters, and that's way above the acceptable. It's unacceptable to have those levels of E. coli in the water. So imagine the city does testing occasionally, so once a month or once every 2 months, but the communities have to live with this river on a daily basis. So what they're experiencing isn't this once in a moment where the E. coli levels are low, but multiple moments where there's a spike in the pollution in the river. And that's not taken into cognizance in terms of the reporting back of, what kind of pollution is entering into the river.
Yeah.
So we highlighted that in the article that testing needs to be reconsidered, how often we do it, when you do it, so that it actually is reflective of what is going on in the environment.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to come to you just now, Prof. Green, because I want to also understand how the E. coli gets into the body water sources. But Nikiwe, just on the regular testing and some of the testing and the studies that you had done, the city at the time also claimed that the laboratories that were being used and cited were not accredited with the South African National Accreditation System, the SANAS, for very specific analyses. Is that accurate? That, where you're doing your testing, it may not be at an accredited laboratory?
That is untrue. We only work with accredited laboratories. For this particular study, we were with SABS. So.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Okay, let's then come to you, and certainly you want to add, Prof. Green, but as you make your additions to those comments, could we perhaps understand how E. coli and E. coli at those levels are finding itself in those body water sources?
Well, thank you. I wanted to add to what Dr. Solomon had to say around communities' experiences of rivers. Now, if you're a farmer, if you're farming sheep or you've got horses, you take them down to the water to drink. They're standing in the edge of the river in the mud, and they're drinking from the edge of the river. The water contamination at that edge of the river, in that mud, is likely to be far more intense than the central flowing channel of the river that's flowing fast. So the city, for example, would routinely be taking samples from the center, fast-flowing part of the river. And again, that's not what lived experience is.
Okay, and how the E. coli is at such high level and traces that it's being found, how does it get to that point?
Well, we've got throughout the city's water infrastructure design. The infrastructure design for Cape Town's sewer processing plants uses rivers to discharge effluent. Now, that would be treated, but it would be poorly treated, and the data backs this up. That water is very poorly treated. In other words, it's going to be carrying some microbes, and it's going to be carrying a lot of chemicals, particularly the chemicals of concern.
Is that an absolute fact, or is that the inference? The fact that there's such high levels means that it must be poorly treated, or do we know for an absolute fact that the treatment levels are not adequate?
We know for a fact that the treatment levels are not adequate. The data is out there. It was not only done by ourselves, but also through the Water Resources Research. Sorry, not the Water Resources Commission did some research. Prof. Petrik was part of that study, and they tested the outflow water. But also the city's data itself. Now, at the time when they attacked us in 2018, 2019, they attacked us in the Daily Maverick. What was astonishing to us was that a year later, when there was a new management in the Department of Water and Sanitation in the city of Cape Town, courageously, the new executive director decided to release the data. And what was astonishing to us was that they knew at the time that they attacked us that our data was substantively correct and substantively matched their data. So one has to ask, why was there such a concerted effort to attack independent science rather than take on board the samples we were finding and think through together with us, how do we solve this?
Yeah, look, I mean, and I think, what you're saying, it requires, further questioning of the City of Cape Town's response, because I'm just reading their response to the initial Project Blue report that, Prof, they said was very limited, that the authors had acknowledged that the data had been limited. Of course, Dr. Nikiwe, having responded to the issue around the laboratories not supposedly being accredited laboratories as an absolute lie. The claim here that your data and your scope is limited. What do you have to say to that, Prof?
I really don't know how to respond to that. But in terms of the scope of our data being limited, according to whom? Because the research that we were doing was for the people, and they were showing us the areas of concern. So we collected the data, we took the samples to accredited laboratories to test, and we did this not just once, but over several occasions. So we had to corroborate, and also our colleagues, Leslie Petrik, Cecilia Ojemaye, had been conducting studies over years of the pollution in these water systems. So we do have the backing of the kind of methodological knowledge of how to do the science, of how to carry out this type of research. And we're also using accredited institutions to test the water samples. So in terms of the accusations of us not following protocol, it's unfounded.
All right. We do, in fact, and happy now to welcome Professor Leslie Petrik, the leader of the Environmental and Nanoscience Research Group at UWC. Prof. Petrik, good morning to you. Thank you very much for your time. As stated there by Dr. Nikiwe, you guys have been doing this for quite some time. And I suppose then I want to understand for how long has this been the case that, as we've established now, that as Prof. Lesley Green had indicated, that, it is quite categoric that the treatment methodology of the city perhaps is inadequate, which is what is leading to this high concentration of E. coli and intercocci that we find, for instance, in these water systems, upon which there's a concentration, particularly at the river mouths, that animals feed on and so on. And yes, invariably, sometimes human beings also being exposed then to this bacteria, high levels of bacteria that's in the water. For how long has this been the case, and are there concentrated areas that point exactly to where the problem may well lie? Prof. Petrik, good morning.
Morning. The thing is that the city's wastewater treatment plants have been malfunctioning for many years. And I think it was in 2014, the city actually stopped giving out the data because it was looking so bad. It might have even been before that. And it was only somewhere in the 3 or 4 years ago that they started showing the data again, after we had many interactions with them to try and make them transparent again. It really only started with Jordan Hill Lewis, who allowed the data to be transparent again. Previously, they would release some of the data to the residents' associations, but the people would have to sign non-disclosure agreements. So the residents' association leader would have the data, but they wouldn't be able to share it with their community. So that was one of the things that we fought about for a very long time before that non-disclosure got removed. And the fact that the data was actually so bad for so long is evident if you look at a report that the CSIR did for the city, where they give the data for many years and they show the trends of the pollution, and it keeps on getting worse and worse because the city is growing and there are more and more of us. And the wastewater treatment plants were designed for a city of about 1 million people, not for a city that's just growing and growing and growing and growing. And, the trouble is that it's not just E. coli that's in the water or enterococci. Those are indicator organisms. They show us that there are pathogens that are disease-causing organisms that are with the sewage. So everybody who's got an illness is busy defecating, let's be blunt, and that goes into the sewage. And those bacteria get spread all around. There's worms as well, there are viruses. So sewage is dangerous. It's not healthy to be in contact with sewage. And the other thing is that we're using a huge amount of different chemicals these days. And these chemicals are also going into the ocean. If you think of all the chemicals that are in the supermarkets and in the pharmacies that you're buying every day and using in your household, it all goes down the drain. And it all goes into the sea because our wastewater treatment plants are not designed to take those chemicals out. And the thing is that most of our wastewater treatment plants are actually not able to deal with the volumes of liquid that is going into them. So most of the effluents that are coming out there are poorly treated and full of bacteria. They do not use disinfectants on the effluents that are going into our rivers and into our sea. And, the marine outfalls are putting absolutely raw sewage into the ocean. The effluents from the wastewater treatment plants are a little bit treated, but the marine outfalls are putting raw sewage out.
Explain that to us very quickly, the difference between the treated sewage and where that treated sewage goes and where those marine outflows are. Because are you then saying the city treats sewage for some bit and for the other bits they don't, and what then the methodology or the thinking is behind dumping raw sewage into the oceans? Because to me, as the non-educated layman on these sorts of issues, Joe Soap of the public, that sounds terribly dangerous to do. So what is the internationally accepted standard for the way in which we discard with sewage?
Look, almost all sewage that gets dumped into the sea along the Atlantic seaboard has just come straight from the households, gone through a pump station, and gets through a pipe into the ocean round about 1 kilometer out.
Jesus, yes. That sounds pretty crazy that happens.
Yeah, so all the sewage from Salt River all the way around to Hout Bay is going into the marine environment without treatment. So the whole city, the actual city's sewage is going out into the marine environment. Sea Point's sewage is going into the marine environment, and Hout Bay and Camps Bay's sewage is going into the marine environment with no treatment. There's just pump stations. They just collect the sewage and they pump it straight out. So everything that everybody excretes from Salt River to Hout Bay is going out into the marine environment without treatment. It is pumped out about 1 kilometer, but the trouble is that the weather changes all the time and the wind blows in different directions, and that stuff gets pushed right against the coast very frequently. And that is why the beaches are full of bacteria, and that is one reason we were testing in Project Blue along Camps Bay Beach, because that's supposed to be a blue flag beach, and that's another topic we'll get to. Now, the thing is, the marine outfalls were designed, especially the Greenpoint one, was designed more than 100 years ago. And people have been protesting about that marine outfall for 100 years or 120 years by now, or even longer. So that's nothing new about that. That was always the engineers ended up with that solution because they thought with short-term thinking that it's cheaper to do that. But those pipes keep breaking and the sewage is not far enough out if you're going to pump raw sewage out. And, internationally, you asked about the situation there. I can't speak for every country in the world, but let's take Australia, for instance, where that sewage is being pumped, the effluent is being pumped into the sea. It's actually treated before it's pumped out into the sea, and it's pumped out much further into the ocean. But, the thing is, we cannot use the ocean as a dumping ground for our effluent because of the chemicals, because there are very few treatment plants, and one has to acknowledge this. Worldwide, there are very few treatment plants that actually take the trouble to take the chemicals out. We did a study with the Norwegians and looked at the wastewater treatment plants in Stavanger, and they were actually releasing the chemicals out into the ocean, although all the excrement and pathogens had been taken out of it. So the difference between the first world country and our country is that the pathogens and the excrement are not taken out. And what we're also finding is that those disease-causing organisms are starting to become antimicrobial resistant. In other words, they're turning into superbugs because the chemicals that we're throwing down with our excrement are actually driving resistance against anything that disinfects them or kills them. And the ones that survive are not treated. You can't use antibiotics to treat them anymore because most of our frontline antibiotics are not able to kill them. And this is the disease-causing organisms. So Prof. Joe Barnes can tell you some more about that, but it's really a big problem because, if we start creating diseases here that can't be treated with antibiotics, we're done for.
And especially when those superbugs and others are in circulation. And Dr. Nikiwe, I want to come to you in just a bit to talk about harm to marine life and, particularly marine life that, consumers or the humans end up consuming, at some stage, during fishing processes and so on, since we are a coastal city. So I want to come to that. But before I do that, Prof. Green, is there then some irrefutable connection between accounts, particularly over the last 2 years, over the last 2 summers, where beachgoers were complaining about, having suffered gastrointestinal issues on account of what they believed to have been swimming in the oceans. There were these particular claims that were being made, and oftentimes being denied, and questions being raised about whether truly it can be the case, given the highly concentrated levels of E. coli and others, of course, other bacteria that we now see, and the raw sewage being dumped and the chemicals into the oceans 1 kilometer in. Though, as Prof. Leslie Petrik says, that naturally will make its way with ocean currents to our beaches, for instance. Is there then a real link here between some of those gastrointestinal stomach issues throwing up that people were experiencing and the way in which the city is either treating and or discarding of the waste?
Well, thank you. Late last year in the summer season, there were a number of reports that came out that surfers had become ill or swimmers had become ill. I read those reports with great interest because I'm a paddler. I kayak out in the ocean and on Zikufle as often as I can. And, in many senses, my involvement in this whole project began because I'm a paddler. And in 2014, we found ourselves repeatedly traveling in these sewage, the stinking, bubbling mess. After a while, you learn where not to go. And we figured out for ourselves as paddlers, because people were getting sick, we figured out that typically the dangerous times are when the water starts to get cold, sort of around about April and onwards. And of course, with that change of season, the northwester wind starts to blow. So if you're paddling in 3 Anchor Bay Green Point, warm water is going to bubble to the surface when the seawater is cold, and it's going to get blown into shore. And we made that case, and we were told that this was rubbish. And then I was astonished to find a set of reports that were protected by non-disclosure agreements, a set of studies done by the city, which showed exactly what we had argued, that when the water is cold and the northwester is blowing, the sewage is going to bubble to the surface and be blown in. And I think, those studies are paid for by the city and therefore paid for by ratepayers. Our South African Constitution guarantees the right to information. The public have got the right to know data that government has. That's in our Constitution, our Bill of Rights. Also, there's freedom of scientific inquiry. So rubbishing what scientists have to say is really not a helpful way to go about science. We also have the right guaranteed in our Constitution to a clean environment. So all 3 of those issues cast into question the the way that the city is going about communicating information, which sounds like science but does not stand up to scientific scrutiny, and keeping data under wraps. And I also want to point out that the summer beach quality data is not on a weekly basis. It's a divide. The way that the data has been produced is a 12-month rolling average. Now, if you think of your own bank account, a 12-month rolling average of your bank account is not going to be very helpful for you to know what you can spend and what you can't spend. A 12-month rolling average, in other words, it's the average for 12 months, and then when you have a new month, that the bracket of the 12 months moves up. So March to February, April to March, and so on. So that way of presenting data hides more than it teaches.
Yeah.
So there's, we are calling for a change in the way data is communicated and for a change in the way data is collected.
Saturday passed or Sunday passed. The sun was briefly out and decided to take a drive, to fish hook around there, and went to the harbour at some stage to go and have some fish, and decided to actually buy some fish at the harbour that is in my freezer at the moment that I want to have sometime soon. And I suppose against that backdrop, how concerned, Dr. Nikiwe, should I and other Cape Townians be about marine life that is being caught with a view to consume moving forward, given the fact that these ocean bodies of water now may well be compromised on account of the amount of effluent and or treated sewage that's flowing into the oceans?
I think Professor Leslie Petrik would better be positioned to answer this, because her research team has actually conducted the studies on fish in Hout Bay.
Yeah, so let me put it to her, because she, of course, is the leader of environmental and nanoscience, and nanoscience in particular, has a very close look at some of that data. So Prof. Petrik, on that score, should Cape Townians be concerned about marine life, not just harm to them, but also, the consummation of the consuming, for instance, of fish in our body water sources?
Yes, look, the thing is, we've done the actual studies. We have looked at all the marine biota that we could lay our hands on up to now, from your mussels to your seaweeds to your fish to a whole lot of other creatures. And these chemicals that I've been talking about are bioaccumulating in these organisms. In other words, their levels are relatively low in the background seawater. But when you look at these organisms, the levels of those chemicals are about 1,000 times higher than in the background seawater, because these organisms take them in and they can't metabolize them because they're not designed for these organisms. We might be able to metabolize them and excrete them, but they can't do it, or else they can't do it fast enough. And the thing is, then, if you do eat that, you're not just getting one chemical in, you're getting many different chemicals in. I mean, our budget wasn't big enough to test for thousands of chemicals, but we tested for about 55 different chemicals. And those chemicals were all more or less present in the different organisms that we found. And we've now done this study from Greenpoint, Camps Bay, Hout Bay, and 8 sites around False Bay along the coast. And all the organisms we found along the coast were contaminated. We also went down into the middle of False Bay, and we tested the sediments down at the bottom of the sea. The sediments down at the bottom of the sea are contaminated with these chemicals. And we then went and tested fish that we got at Cork Bay Harbour. And those fish were pelagic fish and reef fish. And both types of fish had perfluorinated compounds in them. They had pesticides in them. They had pharmaceuticals in them. They had industrial chemicals in them. We tested those classes of chemicals. Our publications are out there. You can have a look. We're busy with a survey of the penguins. And I'm sorry to say the penguins are also full of those chemicals. And that study will be published relatively soon. So it's really very, very extensive how far the sewage plumes are affecting our marine life. The city claims that it's only 200 to 500 meters around where the water gets into the sea, whether that be the marine outfall or the river estuary discharges. But this stuff moves. The sea takes these chemicals all over. And we're finding these chemicals on Robben Island. We're finding these chemicals at Stony Point. So the chemicals are a very good indicator of where the sewage travels to, because we also did a study and we proved that these chemicals are in the sewage from the treatment plants in Cape Town. And even the city's own studies that they have published show that these chemicals are all over our coastline and in our rivers. So there's no doubt anymore, but the city doesn't want people to know this. And really, I would not be buying fish from Cork Bay Harbour. Sorry to say, I'm very sorry for those people.
Are you being serious? You're saying there's a very, very real risk of the fish that we're buying at Cork Bay Harbour, not that it's about Cork Bay, but these harbours, that there's a concern about the quality of that fish, that's actually a very real concern.
Yes. The trek fishers that pull out their nets there along the Sunrise Beach, or what is it called, past Muizenberg there.
Yeah.
They're fishing right where the Cape Flats wastewater treatment plant's effluent is coming down into the ocean. I mean, those harders must be absolutely toxic. And the snook that you buy from the trucks all over the show that get caught around here, I mean, we saw the snook was full of these chemicals. So people are really suffering from exposure to a plethora of different chemicals when they eat this fish. And look, the point is that we need to remember that all these wastewater treatment plants are producing solid residues. And we haven't done a full study yet, but from our observations, these residues do not end up in a toxic landfill. They end up on people's agricultural grounds. And those sludges from the wastewater treatment plant, the dried stuff, in other words, our excrement that's been chomped with bacteria, that stuff is actually also full of these chemicals. And that's being spread across our agricultural lands. And, many people are busy buying those effluents from the city to water their, the effluent that comes out of the wastewater treatment plant is being used to irrigate sports fields and used in factories, etc. And that water is not safe.
Oh,
so
goodness! If it's not mass produced food, then it is agriculture that uses pesticides, and now fish that one cannot trust. This is terribly depressing, to be honest, to come to know, but equally alarming, and it's things that we should be aware about, and perhaps I should be applying a lot greater pressure on the municipality to come in account and not just dismiss some of these findings like they did with the Baloo report. Dr. Nikiwe, is there any other way that modern cities can contemplate the way in which it deals with its waste? Look at our landfills at the moment. They're growing bigger and bigger. We've tried as a country to a certain extent to make everyone aware about the harmful impacts of plastic pollution and particularly nanoplastics and so on. And that's, a completely different conversation that we're not even bringing in here. But now that we focused on, the ways within which, I suppose, and some of your research dealt with this, the sort of ecological well-being and the issues around sustainability, is there a better way, that is sensitive to our spending constraints, that we as a city can consider, as a modern city, the way in which we treat and process and dump our wastage?
I think it will take a massive joint effort from your businesses, from your manufacturing industries, right down to the city and community members themselves. So it's not just a one size fits all, but we need to look at the entire production process. Professor Petrik was talking about the chemicals of emerging concern. The manufacturers that design these drugs need to reconsider, the chain that keeps these drugs so tightly bound together. So it's a multiple layered thing. But what we're saying in this article is that once we're aware of these things, the conversations need to start happening. We know that some engineers at UCT are trying to work on redesign of wastewater treatment plants. There are people that are working on different aspects, but if we continue to accuse each other and to continue to fight about the science, then there's no way that we can actually move forward and develop the solutions that you are asking us to think of.
Oh, goodness. Prof. Lesley, your last thoughts on where to from here, because I mean, in the week we were moaning and complaining about scenarios in which our canals and riverways are getting polluted with, and they're rising because the drainage systems is a problem, and what people are throwing in there, and there's no real opportunity and ways for people to dump some of those other bits of wastage in the forms of what's in their bins and so on. Of course, we're talking about a different kind of wastage at the moment, and contemplating what we imagine to be a modern city that isn't, quite being so negligible about the way it is dumping its waste, and in the process causing harm to marine life and by extension to human beings as well. And it seems like a bigger than a head scratch moment, that surely it requires urgent conversation about the future that we want to build.
Absolutely. And thank you for a great question. I want to emphasize that this is not a problem. The pollutant problem is not a problem limited to Cape Town. It's a global problem. And at the moment, you've got the United Nations Environment Programme putting a lot of effort into raising awareness of the kinds of harms that are occurring everywhere, as Prof. Petrik has described, for example, using effluent or sludge from wastewater treatment works and putting that onto fields. It's a global problem, and you'll see recent stories about that in the US, in the UK, everywhere. So the problem is a problem of our time. It's a problem of our historical moment. And I think for me, that is the most important thing that I want to put to our city's leaders, that excellence in governance is not defined by the absence of pollutants, but by the will to acknowledge them. If we can acknowledge them, we can deal with them. And like any other problem in life, if we can acknowledge them, we can deal with them. And again, I want to say that there have been some important first efforts. The Cape Flats Wastewater Treatment Works is being upgraded and so on. But we have to be able to work together, and arguing and fighting over whose data is correct and pretending that the city officials alone have got the access to ultimate truth is not helping us. We need to be able to work with data. Science is about being permanently open to refutation, right? That's how science works. You're open to counter-argument and counter-data, and you take that in. That's where the authority of science comes from. You can't just say, I speak in the name of science, I've got this data, I'm right, and then dismiss anybody who says your data doesn't match theirs. That's not how science works. So our call is to the city to acknowledge the problem and to practice science in its full sense of being open to counter evidence, so that we can think together, change the way that these contaminants and harms are building up in our city. We can do this, but we have to start by acknowledging the problem.
And I look forward to extending an invitation to the City of Cape Town to have them come and respond and or bold on the conversation. And I don't think it's a us against them, them against us approach. It should be how do we collectively have an honest conversation about what we are presented with and how to ameliorate and or overcome it. So let's see what we can achieve with that interview with the City of Cape Town, hopefully tomorrow. Lovely conversation, albeit on a very difficult and hoary subject. Thank you very much, Professor Lesley Green, there to the end, the Director of Environmental Humanities South. Also on the program was Professor Leslie Petrik, the leader of the Environmental and Nanoscience Research Group at UWC, and Dr. Nikiwe Solomon, a senior lecturer at University of Cape Town. Her research largely deals with matters of the interface between science, technology, politics, and urban river and water management in the environmental humanities, and of course talking to us there about some of the research and the way the research had been conducted.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.